Okay, here we go. We are in our, I think it's the 8th annual Skeptics series of some extent. And here's why we're so passionate about here. It's probably mostly just a reflection of kind of my past, is why 11:12 is so big on what we call apologetics. Apologetics is a big word, and it essentially comes from a Greek word, apologia or apologia, which means a defense of something. In the book of 1 Peter, Peter admonishes Christians to always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that lies within them. And in that, we derive this idea of a defense. And maybe growing up in church, here's what was my experience was this, or maybe just in culture right now. It's really hard to find a Christian who has a brain in culture, like in cultural media, right? Like you give me a movie that you've seen where the Christian in the movie was a hero instead of some either like backwoods redneck or overly judgmental son of a frick. You know what I'm talking about? Like just no matter what you do, you're either watching a movie that makes you want to cringe up to like Christian produced movies that you're like, oh, this is awkward and uncomfortable, or it's a secular produced movie and the Christian is like Amanda Bynes' character in Easy A, or they're the ones that are, they're either back hills, I'm gonna kill you if you don't believe in Jesus, or they just think they're better than everyone. And this is kind of the rhetoric we get concerning Christianity. There's not a lot of thought given into it. It's a lot of the punitive ideas are Christians by culture, and there's not really any basis for. I think even as Christians we fall into this. I know growing up in church, I would ask really difficult questions of my youth pastor. My youth pastor's answer was almost always, God wants us to believe everything based on faith. I believe that was true. I believe that God wanted us to accept his existence, the story of Jesus. I thought he wanted us all to take that all on blind faith. That's what I was told all growing up. And so I thought, well, if someone tells you to kind of aimlessly believe something without any evidence or proof, they're normally wrong, right? It's like when my kid messes up and I say, Harper, what happened here? And Peyton is trying to go like, no, don't ask her, right? Or if I get upstairs and they're trying to hide the evidence of something, the person who speaks the least is normally the one who has the most to lose, right? Because, and this is what I heard, if there is, one person told me this legitimately. They said, if there was evidence that God didn't exist, they said, I would still be a Christian. And I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Like that's what even Paul says the same thing. Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians, he says, if Jesus Christ was not killed, buried, and resurrected, then our faith is futile. We should go do something else, right? And yet over and over again in Scripture, if we're taught the idea that all of our faith is supposed to be this blind, unguided process, yet in Scripture, when Jesus is questioned on things, he delivers evidence. When Jesus is questioned on his death and resurrection, he has people put their fingers in the holes of his hands and his side. It says at one point, Jesus showed up to 500 people in unison so that one person wouldn't just say, I saw him and that would be it. We have collective eyewitnesses from all over the ancient Near East that are all exclaiming to have seen Jesus post-mortem, who saw him after he was raised back to life. And you get this idea when Paul goes to Mars Hill to argue with the pagans there, he uses evidence for God's existence. And all throughout Scripture, it seems as if the real call of the Christian is not to believe blindly or to believe on blind faith, but rather to run the ramp of all good reason, and then eventually you need to take a leap of faith. Every worldview is going to ask you to take a leap of faith. A secular worldview is a very religious worldview, okay? And that's what I didn't believe growing up. I thought that atheists were, and this is how media paints them, right? Like the smartest person in any movie is the atheist. They're the ones that don't believe in God. They've got big issues with it, right? Like even watching Friends, like Ross is like the atheist on the show, and he's the scientist and everything, and then the ditzy blonde Phoebe is the one who's not quite sure whether or not there's a God, but she kind of talks like a Christian every once in a while, and she has these existential thoughts, and she's the ditzy dumb blonde, right? This is basically how society paints it. So I thought, I'm a pretty smart person, so I should probably be an atheist, and I don't want to be a Christian because they're basically dumb people. And this was the way that it was painted to me. And then when I got in churches, I was right. Christians are typically dumb on this subject. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to navigate it. Okay, I was at a conference last week in Iowa teaching about God's existence, and I had someone come up to me afterwards, and they said, I have all these questions about Christianity, but nothing that you said lines up with anything that this person at my church has talked to me about. And what their person in the church was saying was if they prayed hard enough or they trusted their heart when they read scripture, they would just find that God existed. And he goes, but I didn't hear you saying any of that. You didn't say just trust your heart, all these things. And I said, no, do not trust your heart. Your heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, Jeremiah 17 verse 9 says. Don't trust your heart, trust your mind. Trust what you can know. Trust those different things. And I was never given that permission growing up. I thought to be a Christian, you had to kind of check your brain at the door, and then you had to basically assert that everything that was proven through methodological naturalism was the only thing that was true. Where we find ourselves now in culture is we have continued to push away the God hypothesis to such a degree that now when people bring it up, they're completely written off in the first place. There's a guy a few years ago at Northern Arizona University, and he discovered a triceratops head, and he looked inside the tusk, and the tusk still had soft tissue cells that were there, that any model of evolutionary theory would say that every bit of soft tissue would be completely exterminated by the number of billions of years, millions of years since dinosaurs roamed the earth, and that yet he found a piece of soft tissue, and then he lost his job. And this is kind of where we are. We're not really having a conversation anymore. We're just saying, believe what secularists believe or else. And then we paint the opposite as people are stupid. This happened to me last week when I was in Iowa. This guy goes, so you don't believe in evolution? I said, no. And he just started laughing at me. And I went, why are you laughing? And he's like, because evolution is proven. And I went, really? Did this happen yesterday? Where's evolution proven? He's like, all the evidence for evolution. I said, show me any evidence. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, show me evidence of the 4 things that are absolutely necessary for evolutionary theory that there's never been a single bit of evidence for any of these, which is life from non-life, order from chaos, an increase in genetic information, and how you can possibly get mutations to be beneficial to the point where it goes from goo to you via the zoo. Like macroevolution. You show me any evidence of that process, and I'll believe it. Those are 4 leaps in logic, though, that you're making. Life from non-life, order from chaos. And he starts pitching to me Miller-Urey theory of when they started zapping all those proteins, and one of the proteins started have a simple base synthesis. And he goes, see, we can make life on our own. And I started showing him the refutation of that from secular scholars who now completely write off the Miller-Urey experiment. He started talking about Haeckel's diagrams, about how there's all these different embryos and they all look exactly the same, so he came from the same tree of life. I then showed him the proof that Haeckel's diagrams were actually nullified decades ago, and they continue to produce them in textbooks simply because it's a free public use diagram now, but no one believes in Haeckel's diagrams. Turns out we now have the actual embryo, so we don't have to take someone's drawings for granted. We can actually see them, and they look nothing like what he actually drew. But no one's gone and put him on trial. No one said, how dare you? No one came out publicly, but it's proven. Haeckel's embryos. Do you know what I'm talking about, Haeckel's embryos? This guy, he took fetuses at the exact same time, and then he drew them with his own hand, and he drew like a human and a frog and a not a tadpole, but an ostrich, a chicken, like all these embryos, he drew them by hand. And in the fetal stage, he drew them almost exactly alike. And he said, see, evidence. And you went, you just drew that. Now we have pictures of them in the exact same stage that he said they look nothing alike, right? The winged things have wings, and he didn't draw them with they're completely different than what he said. But I don't think any of you either have no clue what Haeckel's diagrams are, or Haeckel's embryos are, or you didn't know that it's been refuted because we continue to publish them in our textbooks. There is not a legitimate search for truth in our culture happening. There is what we call an a priori argumentation that anything supernatural is impossible, and therefore we have to explain the world through methodological naturalism. Well, methodological naturalism deals with only that which is observable, measurable, and repeatable in nature, and presumably then, 99% of the entire observable universe is what we call dark matter or dark energy, which is completely inexplicable in science. So we say as a culture, you must believe strictly in science and nothing that is supernatural. We have no basis or grounds by which to make that assertion. And then when we turn to science, science says, I don't really know what's going on to 99% of the observable universe. So it doesn't seem very comprehensive. The explanatory scope of human existence is really not explained by science. Is science great? Yes, it's beautiful in what it can do, but science is limited in its capacity. It's almost infinitely limited in its capacity, and it fails completely to explain the real truths and the real questions of mankind, right? Science can't tell me how much justice weighs or how powerful the love of a person might be or why we go against our genetic code in almost everything we do as people. Science can only deal with this small little microcosm of all of the observable universe, and yet some people go, well, I don't believe it because it's not scientific. And when you say, what do you mean it's not scientific? They say, well, it can't be proven by the scientific method, and they have adhered to that blindly because they've been told to, because all you have to do is ask one question, which is the scientific method proven by the scientific method? And the answer is no. The scientific method doesn't check out of its own method. It's tautological at its core. It's a circular reason is what that means. So you'll have to excuse me that if I don't take point blank the idea that you want me to put all of my religious faith into a system that can deal with less than 1% of the observable universe and whose very tenets are tautological in nature, saying that you must believe in something because I told you to believe in it, that it itself hasn't been run through the very paradigm it needs to be run through. I'm just not going to do that anymore. And the natural reaction is indignance, just to go, oh, Christians. And this is what Christians do. We've got the evidence for this stuff and they just write it off. But my challenge to you is this. I have talked to so many people who begin to preach to me in sound bites what Christians believe, and then they use nuggets, sound bites, and extremes to tell what the secular community believes or the atheist community believes, and you press them on one or two different things and they just shut their mouth and they have nothing to respond. Like I said, I will completely reject my Christian faith right now if you can give me any empirical evidence or evidence that proves a change in kinds throughout any species in all of history. And they go, well, Darwin's finches. And I went, oh, that's not a change in kinds. That's change within a species. There's not a Christian alive who doesn't believe in microevolution and small changes within a kind in order to create dominance or survival of the fittest. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about goo to you via the zoo. That's what we're talking about. Show me one proven example of macroevolution, and then you go, well, what about the skulls? What about the skulls? That's a religious belief. Look, we found this skull, and this proves, no, scientist doesn't show us that. Okay? Everything we believe concerning particularly evolution is not what science has told you, it's what a scientist has. Science doesn't tell you anything. Science doesn't conclude things. Science itself doesn't have a personal mind. Science is just data. We give narrative to the data that we find. And this is what this guy said. He goes, what about homologous structures? You guys know what homologous structures are? Right? You look at a bat and its hand looks suspiciously similar to a human's hand. And they go, see, we're from the same tree of life. We have common ancestry. And then you go, well, who told you that? Did the data actually tell you that, or did a data analyst tell you that? Because what if I told you that the reason that a bat's hand and a human's hand look exactly the same, at least in form, which again, I'm always like, I don't think but it's neither here nor there. Even if they did, would that really do anything more than to prove that we came from a common creator? Because common ancestry and common creator, right? Like when Ford began to have like the rubber tires that he put, or the rubber wheels that he put on cars, when he makes a new car, if he was like, you know what? Those rubber wheels worked perfect. Those rubber tires worked perfectly. But now I'm going to change the way I do everything. What would be better than a rubber round wheel? Rubber round tire. Let's try something else. No. If someone has found something that works, why would you not put it in everything that requires something that's very similar to that? Right? Well, a human's eye and a squid's eye are very similar. First of all, they're not even close to being similar. We have a photo-optic sensitive lens that is able to zoom in and zoom out and to focus and to unfocus. And the amount of energy that's expended in our body for our eyes to work are nowhere near a squid's eye. If you mean, well, in form and function, they work basically the same, then yes, that's great proof for God. And someone goes, no, it's great proof for common ancestry. And I look at that and I go, that's why I don't argue common ancestry or common creator when it comes to homologous structures. Because I see something and I say, well, if I'm Salvador Dali and I think clocks look like this, what you're going to find in my next painting is I'm going to paint a clock very similar to the one I did in this one. You wouldn't say, oh, a forgery, Or both of those pictures must have come from a common ancestor. You would say someone drew both of those pictures. They use the same idea of clocks in both. They use the same, if God makes eyes and these eyes work and they can see, why would he not use them in multiple species, in multiple kinds? Eyes are eyes. You wouldn't make something that doesn't work for one species and one that works for another species. So science doesn't tell us. Science doesn't conclude that for us. Scientists do. So when someone gets in an argument with me about homologous structures, I always go, you are making my point. The point is that science didn't tell you that. Okay? And every time I see it, they're like, see how they're exactly the same? I'm always like, no, they don't look the same to me. But then I'm forced to when I start taking a test when I'm in my high school, right? Like I'm graduating with honors at the top of my class because I had to write down in my biology text or in my biology final, I had to go, those are as a result of common ancestry because I wanted to get a good grade. But I don't believe that. But this is kind of the water that we're swimming in. What you might find is if you feel like a lot of Christians can't give as good of explanations or as good of reasons as your secular friends, well, guess what? The majority of the Christians in here haven't spent 13 years in a system that's trying to teach them the basis of secular reasoning. So of course you've got a leg up. And that's what I thought. I thought that Christians were dumb, but I also didn't realize I swam in the water of secularism. And then I challenged atheism because I was an atheist myself at that point because there was no proof found as far as the people that I was talking to. So I tried atheism and I said, fine, I'm going to prove to the Christians that their worldview is stupid and that it's wrong and that atheism is correct, that there is no God. So then I started testing atheism and I went, is this really what we have? I stood on every single principle that I had, thinking that atheists were super intelligent and that Christians were dumb. And then I dove into the framework and I said, we're not answering the most simple, fundamental, basic questions of anything. The majority of everything that I read in atheist textbook had to do with making fun of Christians or making fun of the way that they treat each other or talking about Catholicism and the cover-up of that or how God's a xenophobe at heart. Like the strongest atheists in the world are writing books called The Moral Landscape and The God Delusion and Christopher Hitchens' big proclamation that religion is poisonous to everyone. And yet I never was challenged on anything. And I told this guy this. It's a guy that I met when I was first starting college, when I was kind of practicing my atheism in its fullness. And he said, do you think a worldview is right or wrong based on its body count? And I said, I think if we're killing a whole bunch of people, I think then we shouldn't follow that worldview. Because I had just talked about Sam Harris, and Sam Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape. In The Moral Landscape, this famous atheist said, whatever is good does not need God because good is just whatever is best for the most amount of people. He said, whatever is evil is whatever is worse for the most amount of people. Whatever brings the most amount of pain is evil. Whatever brings the most amount of pleasure is good. So Sam Harris wrote this whole book saying, all good things are pleasurable for the most amount of people, and all bad things are painful for the most amount of people. And I read that book, and I thought I had everything figured out. And I met one Christian who knew what they were talking about. I only needed one. And then he simply said to me, he said, okay, so when it comes to what's good and what's evil, all you've done is you've epistemologically told me the reason why we think certain things are good and certain things are evil. What is your basis for thinking that pleasure is good and pain is bad is the seat of why humankind perceives, what's the foundational basis for morality beyond that? In other words, if we all agree, good, it's whatever is pleasurable for the most amount of people and painful for the least amount of people, what happens when someone says, what if someone disagrees with what's pleasurable and with what's painful? I would say there's countries right now who think the best amount of good for the most amount of people would be to exterminate America. Do you agree? You agree? Okay. I don't mean do you agree with the fact that we should all be eliminated, but yeah, you're saying certain people around the world believe that if they could push a button right now to make the world a more pleasurable place, that America would be wiped off the map. Do you think there's Americans right now who believe there's certain countries that we should push a button and wipe them off the map, and that would be the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people and the least amount of pain for the most amount of people? Do you believe there's countries right now, or at least people groups right now, that we should be able to push a button, they're all exterminated, and the world will be a less painful place? Most humans would say, yes, I could think of at least one group of people or one belief system where if we got rid of all of them, more people would experience more pleasure and less pain. So the problem comes in is if you believe that concerning, let's say, Iran, and Iran believes that concerning us, when we get in the same room together, who's right? When they think the most amount of pleasure leads to the amount of pain is an extermination of America, and you believe the most amount of pleasure leads to the amount of pain is an extermination of Iran, then who wins? What if their supreme ethic is power and your supreme ethic is kindness? Ultimately, if there is no God, then you believing that kindness is superior to power is just the chemical fizz of your intrinsic DNA fizzing in such a way that you believe that what you think is better than someone else's. There's no basis for it. You just think that's the way that it is. So you're not answering a question of moral ontology. You're asking a question of moral, or you're answering a question of moral epistemology, which isn't the question at its core. It's why should we follow that? It's not what do you think it is. It's why ought I follow that? It's the ought. And when you derive an ought from an is, you've committed what we call the taxi cab fallacy. Look it up in your own time. I don't have time to go into it. When you say, here's how things are, therefore that's how they ought to be, that's not the question. The question is, what ought they be? You can't just start describing me why it is the way that it is. You need to tell me why it ought to be the way it ought to be. So at its core, I kept diving into these questions, and I realized that the intellectual backing of the atheist worldview was bankrupt. And I was pissed because I had already done this big shebang with my dad, who's a pastor, talking about how Christianity is false and I'm going to prove it to him. And I had made my position clear. I went to church and I was an atheist who went to church. I thought that was really like progressive. Right? I was an atheist at church, like, hey guys, I don't believe in God, but I'm going to be here. If you have any real questions, I'm here to answer them for you. And then when people would ask me, I would regurgitate information that I had heard in secular mainstream media. And then I met one Christian who knew what they were talking about, and it wrecked my worldview. Wrecked it. So I just got to ask basic questions. The natural response to being challenged on your worldview is to run away, to sit back in your echo chamber. And that's what we do, right? Echo chambers are really powerful, but they're much more powerful in the atheistic community than they are in the Christian community, and I can prove it to you, right? The majority of Christians that I know that are apologists are able to give almost the entire response of what the atheist is going to say in a debate. When I go into a debate, so I'm an apologist, so I go to like formal debates at colleges and stuff like that. When I go into a debate, I could tell you to the 90th percentile exactly what my opponent is going to say. Because I've read those books. I know their thoughts. I know their theology or atheology. I know everything they're going to say. I know they're going to levy at some point an ad hominem attack against the way that Christians treat people. They're going to talk about God being xenophobic. They're going to say that he condones slavery in the Old Testament. They're going to say that there's no backing, that the word nothing actually could mean everything if they're going to do cosmology. I know that when it comes to morality, they're going to say that everything is relative. I know everything that you're going to say. And when atheists in particular now come and challenge me, they throw these things at me that they saw on YouTube from like Greg the Atheist's channel. And they go, well, do this. And then you answer it for them. And then what they do on the regular is they jump back in their echo chambers and they talk about how, but they don't keep talking. A terrible thing levied against atheists is atheists, when challenged, retreat into echo chambers and then they resort to indignant speech. I can say this because I used to be one. That's what I would do. I would just go, stupid Christians. But that's not an answer to a question. When you get challenged in your worldview to put your fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 where are my friends? And then you get back with them and you go, this is what he did. That's not a comprehensive result to the solution. That's not a solution to the problem. You haven't really answered it. But I'm going to already make you a guess. My guess is that the majority of people in here who believe something contrary to what we're going to teach are not going to engage me. They'll talk about it with you at school about what they thought about it, but they're not going to engage me because you're safer than I am. And you're safer than I am because you're not learned. And they're learned because they've been doing this for 12 years. They've been in this culture for a long time. I mean, you tell me if it's pitched again and again, day after day in mainstream media, in social media, in every single bit of media, that it ought to be some way, it's terrifying to believe that what if everything you believe about everything was wrong? And it can be. But there's a humility involved in that process that I had to go through of going, what if my intelligible high horse was all incorrect? What if this God thing was real? Now, there's a certain things, if God is real, that make no sense. But I'll tell you what, living from an atheistic worldview, the atheist worldview makes far less sense. It's completely contradictory to itself. It makes no sense, and it does not deal with reality. It deals with a sub-reality or a perfected reality or a super reality, but it doesn't deal with the reality that we live in. For an example, a lot of atheists would say you can't have moral absolutes in atheism, as it were. You just have like moral relativism. But at their core, does anyone know anyone here who actually lives as a moral relativist? Who believes that people who are raped and murdered, we should just all go, well, I guess it was good for them. Or if you believe it's best for the most amount of people, that the people who flew planes into the World Trade Centers weren't just trying their best based on their brain fizz from their ancestry. Or when someone takes a gun into a gay nightclub in Florida and massacres 60 people, that at the end of the day we just have to go, as Richard Dawkins says, we are all DNA just marching to the tune of the music and we dance to its music. Richard Dawkins says at the end there is no good or evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. We are all just subjects of our DNA and we dance to its music. Fantastic. Then how do you put that guy on trial who walks in a nightclub and believes that in a very Darwinian way of thinking that gay people are broken? In a Darwinian way of thinking, they're incapable of passing on their genes. Therefore, if they are just this bag of protoplasm, then they're incapable of doing anything. They're not passing on their genes. They're not doing that stuff. Therefore, they should be eliminated. And if someone has that worldview and they write a manifesto to that extent, I want you to make an argument for me on the basis of atheism why that person is intrinsically wrong. And all you're going to come up with is you're either going to say, I don't like it, that's my opinion, or you're going to appeal to something that's completely counter-Darwinistic. I can tell you why that was wrong from a Christian worldview. I can tell you why what he did was wrong, absolutely. And I don't have to be tongue-in-cheek, and I don't have to talk in a circle, and I don't have to try to say that everything is ultimately not good or not bad or whatever it might be. I can tell you this. Everyone who was killed in that nightclub is an image bearer of God. Gay, straight, indifferent, black, white, doesn't matter. Everyone who's ever been created is an image bearer of God. To exterminate an image bearer is to go against what God is. God is life. To take away life is to do something that's called sinful, which is to be what God is not. When mankind decides that they are going to take life, when it is God's only to take and God's only to give, we have usurped the throne of God and said that I sit in a position above you. The reason that what that man did was wrong is because he took life that wasn't his to take. He murdered an image bearer of God, and when you murder an image bearer of God, you've gone against the will of God. And God is the standard for objective moral truth. What he is good. What he isn't is evil. He is life, which means that murder is wrong. He is truth, which means that lying is wrong. He is good, which means that evil is wrong. It's airtight. You can't touch it. It's foundational. But you're not going to be able to explain to me with any kind of rational rhetoric why anything objectively is right or is wrong. And this is what this guy tried to do at the conference the other week too. This other guy who came up and he said, well, at the end of the day, you can't know that there's anything that's true. I said, so you believe that nothing is true? He says, yes, I believe at its core nothing is true. I said, okay, do you believe that truthfully, that nothing is true? And he said, yes. So nothing is true except for one thing. Because what do you mean? I said, well, you just said that it's true that nothing is true. So there's one thing that's true, and that's that nothing is true. Is that true? And he went, okay, fine. I said, so in the entire universe, there's only one true statement, and that true statement is that everything is true. Correct? He said, yes. I said, okay, so everything is also false. So what do you mean? Well, if nothing is true, then nothing is false. Because if true is what, as Christians, we believe that what is true corresponds to God and corresponds to reality. And if you are going to relinquish the idea of truth, then you also have said that all things are true, all things are false, which means that nothing is true and that nothing is false. It's simple logical reason. So there's no such thing as anything that's false. And he goes, well, no, that's not true. So it's false? He said, yes. I said, okay, so there's only one truth and there's only one falsity in the entire universe, and that is that there is no truth and that some things are false. He said, yes. I said, are you listening to yourself? You're not making any sense. The moment you give up objective moral value, you give up objective truth, you've given up everything. Now you speaking is nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. So, with that as a basis, my postulation or my hypothesis to this whole series is simple. In the grand scheme of everything that we observe, the explanatory scope of the whole universe, the God hypothesis is the most cogent, intelligible, reasonable explanation for our universe. My argument is this. In the marketplace of all paradigms, the Christian paradigm is superior. It's not superior because I said so or because God says so. It's superior because when it comes to inductive reason, deductive reason, when it comes to explanatory value of relevant experience, when it comes to empirical data's satisfaction, all those things combined, the God hypothesis is the only satisfactory paradigm given in our universe. Every other paradigm is weak, or it's broken, or it's falsifiable, simply falsifiable. Now, I'm going to use a word called paradigm throughout this whole series. Here's what I mean by paradigm. Paradigm deals with four things. The first one being origin. Think of a paradigm as like a story you tell yourself to make your life livable. Okay? Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Origin, where do we come from? Meaning, why are we here? Morality, what is good and evil? And destiny, where are we going? Every complete paradigm has an answer to these four questions. The majority of paradigms are incomplete. But every complete paradigm will satisfactorily, in one way or another, answer these questions. And the issue is, you can't have a paradigm about origin that doesn't correspond to the paradigm about meaning. You can't say, well, when it comes to origin, I believe that everything came out of nothing. Okay? So you'd basically be like a nihilist, right? Everything came out of nothing without any help whatsoever. Okay, so then you can't also be what we would consider to be a resolute methodological naturalist. So you can't say, well, when it comes to morality, I believe it's methodological naturalism. When it comes to the origin of things, I'm a nihilist. You have to have a worldview that comprehends with all four of these things because nihilism and methodological naturalism disagree with each other. Right? That's like when people are like, I'm a Buddhist Christian. It's like, you're a what now? A Buddhist Christian. That's not a thing. Straight up, that's not a thing. Well, I'm a Christian, but I'm also like kind of, like I believe in like karma. And it's like, nope, that's not a thing. I'm like a married bachelor, but I'm also married. One of those things. I'm like someone who's like pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. You know what I'm talking about? One of those. No, I don't. You're talking like a psycho. And that's what we get. You have to have a paradigm that doesn't contradict your other paradigms of all these things, and it has to explain everything we see in nature. This idea of ethics, this idea of morality, this idea of complexity, this idea of origin, this idea of where are we going and what are we doing and what gives us meaning and why do we want to know what meaning is in the first place? Why are we beings who can observe the universe who also ask questions of it? What makes humans intrinsically unique amongst all species? And when you say, we're not unique, you don't live that way. So your paradigm is, if it's not able to be practiced, it's just like you're sitting up in a cloud with a whole bunch of people who don't deal with reality. Your metaphysical reality of like, no, at our core, all animals and people are exactly the same. But they're not. We all know this to be true, right? I subscribe, and probably I shouldn't, but I do. On Instagram, I follow an Instagram account called Nature is Metal. You know what Nature is Metal is? It's essentially an Instagram profile that just shows how freaking hardcore nature is. Like yesterday, I watched a great white shark eating a horse because there was like a tsunami and it brought a horse into the ocean, and the horse was already dead. Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, then have at it, Jaws. Right? And then like you watch one, there's like a gazelle on the prairie and it starts like running away. But you see this lion and it's doing its little like, and you're like, oh, he gonna die. And And but I watch that voluntarily. And some people can't stomach it. Some people are like, I'm not into this, right? Everyone's trying to get really cool stuff on there that's not like morbid. But it's just like, it's awesome, right? But like, no one has ever tried to turn in the nature is metal guy by going, you can't show this kind of stuff, right? Elton John straight up is like, circle of life, and it moves us so, right? Someday we become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and it's all part of the great circle of life, says Mufasa, right? Like, we eat the antelope eat the grass, and we're all like, oh, that's a beautiful picture. Did you hear what he just said? I carnivorously devour this species, and then they in turn eat me when I become the grass. We go, oh, the beauty of nature, right? But if you were like, hey, where's Peyton? I'm like, I buried him in my backyard. He's going to give rise to my new flower pots. Circle of life, right? Go watch hippos. If a female hippo gives birth to a male hippo, the dominant male hippo will come and eat the baby, kill it, murder it. And we go, circle of life. We're not the same. We're not the same. And anything you give me for why people have personhood is going to be inferior. You're like, well, we're smarter. Okay, so is personhood based on how intelligent someone is? Do you think there's people who exist right now, and especially in some kind of with special needs or disabilities or in a vegetative state where there's a pig out there that's smarter than a human? Pigs are very intelligent, probably smarter than dogs. So if you have a pig that's smarter than a human, then those two are both about to go down, right, in quicksand, and you only have the chance to save one, should you go, which one of you is smarter? Let me give you a quick series of IQ tests. No, we don't actually believe that. We don't believe that we have intrinsic value as humans because we're smarter than other species. So what, consciousness? Things that have consciousness are to be protected? Well, there's an issue with that. What about humans that are unconscious? When you're asleep, can I cut off your head? Conscious doesn't give value. It's not about consciousness that gives us value. You go, well, what about potential consciousness? Okay, well, now you just usurped any kind of argument against abortion. Because what is a fetus other than potential consciousness? So be consistent with your worldview. Either consciousness creates personhood, or potential consciousness does, or I'm able to murder you when you sleep, and as long as you don't wake up, I'm good. Or people who are in a coma. Shouldn't be protected. They have no value. They have no rights, as it were. This guy wrote a theory a couple years ago, and he said, here's the 13 things that give someone personhood. It's called personhood theory. He said, if we want someone to have value and intrinsic human rights, they have to have these 13 things. This is what makes a person a person. One of them was a strong sense of time. There's a lot of people in this room that I could kill right now, because you're late for everything all the time. And at the end of the day, everyone in the atheist community went like, oh, wow, that's really powerful. Did you hear that? We have personhood theory. But some dude in his underwear was on his couch going, oh, what makes a person a person? Oh, time. And we just go, oh, but he's a scientist. But what's a scientist? A scientist is someone who another group of scientists made a group of things you have to do in order to become a scientist. Where did they get that from? Another group of scientists, at some point, one person at some point had to do what? Self-identify as a what? Scientist. Yeah, someone just went, I pass. And now for you to pass, you must do this. And we go, oh, doctors. But ultimately, a scientist is just someone who went, I took the amount of classes I need to do what I needed to do, and I responded exactly how you wanted to respond because you're the scientist before me. Ask me if scientists have ever gotten anything wrong. Go ahead. Yes, they have all the time. In World War II, we handed out cigarettes like they were candy to everyone on the front line. Then we found out that it kills you, and we've switched our position, right? From the flat earth to the idea of the earth being the center of the universe, that we change stuff all the time. So anytime we say, well, this is the ultimate theory, this is all that's going to attribute my whole world to is this one thing that deals with 1% of the observable universe, that changes every few years, that its own scientific method isn't run through its own scientific method. I'm not anti-science. I'm pro-science, but science deals with a sliver microcosm of what we ought to talk about. When science jumps into the realm of cosmology, you have to say, that's a meta-science, that's not a science. So when people go, well, give me scientific proof that God exists, I'm saying you don't understand terms. I cannot give you proof that God exists because God is by nature supernatural. Science is methodological naturalism. You would be asking me to give you a non-overlapping magisterial authorities switch. That's a NOMA principle. It means that science doesn't have anything to say about morality because morality is a different field of study than that is. You can't test what is moral. You can't measure justice. You can't weigh love. So they're different theories. They're different fields of study. But we have gotten so used to doing that, people tell me all the time, well, give me any kind of scientific proof for God's existence. And I would say, do you understand what the word proof means? There's two different kinds of proof. One is what we call empirical proof, and the other is what we call forensic proof, okay? Empirical proof is things that are testable, verifiable, repeatable in a laboratory, okay? For instance, an empirical proof would be water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Obviously, depending on elevation, but right around 100 degrees Celsius, almost anywhere on the planet Earth. Water is going to boil at that temperature. Okay, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, right? 212. It's empirical. Every time you do it, it does the same thing over and over again. Then you've got forensic science. Forensic science deals with things of history and things of theory, okay? So, last service, what if I made up this story? And I said, last service, a dude fell over in the back. During the end of service, there was an old man, and he was walking in the door, and he didn't see part of the, he's a greeter in live, he's actually one of my good buddies, but he was walking in the door, and he actually tripped over that the big wooden wall in the back, and he fell at the end of last service. True or false? True. How many of you guys were here last service? How many of you guys were not here last service? Okay, so what could you do if you weren't here last service if a group is saying that happened and another group is saying that didn't happen? Because in reality, that didn't actually happen. I just made that up. Right? Oh, you think it actually happened? It did not. That did not actually happen. I paid Karis to say that, so she would make a big deal about this, but that didn't actually happen. How many of you guys weren't here last service? Talia, you weren't here last service? Do you think it happened or do you think it didn't happen? You can start gathering proof. What would you want? What do you want? Who here saw it? You want eyewitnesses? Okay, who was here last service? Keep your hand up if you saw a guy fall at the end of last service. Raise your hand if you heard a guy fall at the end of last service. Okay, put your hands down. What other proof would you want? So you want eyewitness account? What else do you want? Okay, so maybe we can find the guy who fell. We can ask him. Was last service being recorded? It was. Our video was rolling. Do you think it saw the guy that fell? No, because it's obviously pointed at the speaker. But what could you find in the tape? What do you think would happen? There'd be a noise. What would you see of the people that were in the audience? What would they probably do? Turn around. At the end of the day, if I gave you the tape and you heard a noise and it turned around, and what if 98% of everyone who was here last service said that they saw it, and 99% of people said they didn't actually see it, but they actually heard it, would that prove to you empirically that a guy fell back there? No. Is it enough proof for you forensically to believe that someone fell back there? Yeah. That's what we do. That's what we call forensic proof. So we got to be careful when you go like, there's no proof for God's existence. Well, there's forensic proof for God's existence. In fact, when we say forensic proof, we mean it's more likely than its antithesis that it's true. So if that's the proof that you're asking for, you can't ask for empirical proof for God's existence, and you can't ask for empirical proof for God's non-existence. What would be empirical proof if I said, there is no gold in Alaska? There's not a bit of gold in Alaska. If this was the theory, it'd be like, there is no God. Or there is nothing supernatural in all the universe. There's nothing supernatural. And if I said, there is something supernatural, what's my goal? What would I have to do to prove my point? I'd have to find one single solitary supernatural event, and my theory would be proven true. And if yours was, there is nothing supernatural in all of the universe, what would you have to do? You have to prove in the complete history of time and space that nothing has ever transcended or superseded something which is perfectly natural. obviously your task is a little bit bigger than mine is. If I said to find gold in Alaska, you'd have to trace the entire bit of what we mean by Alaska, and you have to prove that there's not a single bit of gold anywhere. If I said there is gold in Alaska, I just need to find the smallest bit of anything that we could possibly consider to be gold, and we would say, there it is. Okay? So we're both asking questions of forensics. The atheist is saying, I believe there's more forensic evidence that God doesn't exist. The Christian is saying, I believe there's more forensic evidence that God does exist because empirical evidence is out the window. Because you can't put God in a test tube, you can't test him in a lab, you can't repeat the origin of the universe, you can't do any of that stuff. So we simply bring our best proofs forward and we say, I believe that it is more plausible than not that God exists. And the atheist says, given all this proof, I believe it's more plausible than not that God doesn't exist. That's it. So not one person can't stand on this high horse of we have all this data and constructed science behind us, and the other side is we believe in blind faith. We both take the data, and we both then give a postulation to the data on what is most plausible. My contention is this. I believe that the God hypothesis is far more plausible, intelligible, and cogent with empirical data, with relevant to our experience, than the atheist proposition is. I'd like to begin to prove that to you right now. Here's my first proof for God's existence, okay? Do we have a little, where's a little, do we have like a thing to erase? Yep, eraser is the word I was looking for. Decided to keep using its noise until I came up with it. There's a guy named Leibniz, and Leibniz was a mathematician, a German mathematician, and I'm going to give you the first proof. When I do a normal debate, like at a collegiate level, I will give 10 different proofs. 10 proofs of God's existence. Today I'm just going to give you one of those 10 proofs. We'll do a couple more throughout the forum and through the rest of the Skeptics forum through this whole series. But right now I just wanted to give you the first one. It's called Leibniz's Argument for God from Contingency, if you want to label the paper or device that you're working on. Leibniz's Argument from Contingency. This is a proof that God exists. When we talk about a proof, what we mean is that philosophically, the syllogism is true, the premises are true, and the conclusion follows rightly from the premises. Okay? So the easiest line of argumentation in all of philosophy is called modus ponens. Okay? If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Okay? So in a line of argumentation, you would say, if this happens, then this happens, therefore that happens, okay? So, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because this, therefore because of this, which is a logical fallacy, but it's a Latin way of saying the same phrase. Here's what it means. A really famous method of modus ponens is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's very simple. It's airtight. It's ironclad. No one argues with the logical finitude of that. No one's saying that that's not true. Modus ponens, it checks out. It's a true syllogism. Okay? So the way that it looks on this table right here is, if Socrates is mortal, or if Socrates is a man, then he is mortal. What's P? Socrates is a man. What's our conclusion? He's mortal, okay? If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. It's called modus ponens, okay, in the original language. It's a Latin phrase, which means it's modus ponens. It's the simplest line of argumentation. So we're going to use the line of argumentation so no one takes any beef with our logic. And now our job is to create premises and a conclusion that follows rightly from it. We're actually going to throw this up on the screen up here. This is Leibniz's argument. Actually, don't throw it up yet. Let me give it to you first. Here's how the argument sounds. Point number one. Actually, throw it up there. I lied. Go ahead. We're running out of time. Here's Leibniz's argument from contingency. Some of y'all can't see it over there, can you? Okay, just trust me. It's great. All right. Point number one says this. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. Okay? He said there's two different ways that things exist. Things either exist out of necessity or they exist out of contingency. Necessary things aren't things necessary for life. So when you ask, what is necessary? You might go, food. Food is necessary for survival. That's not what we mean. We don't mean what's necessary to sustain you. We mean what exists out of its own character and its own necessity, out of its own nature. There are certain things in our universe that exist because they have to exist, okay? Numbers being one such thing. Numbers were never created. There was never a human ever. They exist because they have to exist, okay? They exist. It's an idea. It's an idea that if no human was ever existed and there was 4 cows on Mars, we would still say there is a 4-ness of cows on Mars. There are 4 of those. Now, we would probably use a different language. We'd have a different way of saying it. But sets of numbers exist out of necessity. Okay? They're not created. They can't be destroyed. There's no life without at least the understanding or the idea of numbers. And if there was no life ever, in the nothingness and void of the non-vacuum of all space, numbers would still exist because they exist out of a set of something. Okay? It's a set of data is necessary. The other thing the other way that things exist is out of contingency. Contingency means it needs something to exist. Okay? I'm a contingent being. Kyle is a contingent being. Randy's a contingent being. Lucas is a contingent being. Stars are contingent. Plants are contingent. That couch is contingent. Your iPhone is contingent. When we say contingent, we mean it doesn't exist from itself, which is a self-defeating idea. Someone pitched me one time. They said, the universe made itself. And I said, that's called tautology. They said, what's tautology? I said, it's a circular reason. Circular reasoning says the universe created itself. So you say, well then, what was needed to create the universe? Well, the universe was. And then what did the universe create when it made itself? The universe. So you needed the universe to create the universe, but the universe wouldn't have been there ahead of time to create itself. It's stupid. It doesn't make sense. So the other way is contingency. Things exist because of something else before them. Well, in that infinite line of beforeness, you will ultimately have to hit what? In the infinite line of what was there before, right? My parents, you'd say like, where did Chris come from? I'm contingent. Well, where did I come from? My parents, where did they come from? Their parents, where did they come from? Their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents. Even if you want to take an evolutionary bend, you would eventually wind up with what? A single-cell microorganism. And you answer the question, where did that come from? Okay? In the beginning of all space-time, at the moment of the Big Bang, before that, when everything came into existence, including things that are necessity that were already there, things that are contingent, the argument is simple. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence. Okay? It can be explained either out of contingency or out of necessity. So everything we see is either, oh, that's a contingent thing which explains its existence, which means someone else was before it, or it exists out of necessity, like numbers, rules of logic, things like that. So, in other words, to use an analogy, if you and I are walking on a mountain and we find a tennis ball there, and I say, why is that tennis ball there? Explain to me why that tennis ball is there. And you said, it doesn't need an explanation for why it's there. You're just being lazy, right? Because clearly it does. Especially if we were like in some outback in like Alaska that no one had ever traversed before, and we found a tennis ball, you'd probably go, I thought no one had ever been here before. And we found a tennis ball, and I said, why is this here? And you said it doesn't require an explanation. I would say, well, of course it does, because it's there. It didn't get there it didn't put itself there, and it's not necessary. So something or someone had to manipulate in order for it to be there. And I would say someone because tennis balls don't happen themselves, right? If it said Pen 3 on it and it was the same kind of lime green texture of a normal tennis ball, we would say at some point, because of that simple level of complexity, that a human mind was put at that tennis ball. It might have come from a machine, but the machine always comes from a human mind, right? So if that's the argument is if a tennis ball requires an explanation for its existence, what if the tennis ball, instead of being tennis ball size, was the size of a car? Would it then require an explanation for its existence? Yes, because size doesn't determine something's reason for needing to be explained. And if size doesn't make any difference, right? If I just started growing the tennis ball slowly, at what point would you go, no longer needs an explanation? It just has always been, or it's eternal, or it's necessary. No matter what you did, if it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, even if it became as big as the size of planet Earth, would it then not need an explanation for its existence? No, it would still require one. Now, if that tennis ball kept growing and it was coexistent with the size of the universe, would it require an explanation? Yes. Size doesn't determine something's value of not needing to be identified or having a reason given to it. So if the universe is a contingent thing, just like a tennis ball, and if the tennis ball was the universe, instead of the universe being the universe, the tennis ball would require an explanation, so therefore the universe requires an explanation for its existence. So the universe must be explained. It must have an explanation for its existence because it's not necessary and it is contingent. If the universe is contingent and every single working model of the universe says that it had a point at which it began, we can then say that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Ironically, this is where atheists especially get really upset because they go, that's a leap in logic. And I'll tell you this, I'm not making any leap in logic that you wouldn't be willing to commit to. Because the only way I can prove that, because if I said the opposite of that phrase, I bet you'd agree with it. The opposite of that phrase is this. If atheism is true, the universe requires no explanation for its existence. True? If atheism is true, the universe doesn't need an explanation for its existence. Is that true? Yes. That means the opposite in all capacities is also true. If atheism is true, the universe requires no explanation, which means opposite. If it does require an explanation, then atheism is false. And if atheism is false, if atheism is false, then what is true? Theism. It's its opposite. If atheism is true, it requires no explanation. So if it has an explanation, atheism is false. Okay? So if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And you go, well, why would we call it God? Well, that's what we mean by a maximally great being. It's a being who is intelligent enough to create everything in nature and in the space-time continuum. It must transcend the space-time continuum, which means it can't be made of matter, time, or it can't be material. It can't be in space, and it can't be, it must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. It must be able to create worlds, and it must have the intelligence to do so. That's basically what we all mean when we say God. Spaceless, timeless, immaterial, superior to everything, able to create all things. Okay? So yes, call it something else then. Call it the powerful personal mind. Great. You're still talking about the same thing, which is what we say God. Well, let's not split hairs here. That's what we mean by God. Then the point number 3 says the universe exists. Okay? We've already proven, no one really refutes that. Is anyone like, the universe doesn't exist? No. That one's self-evident, okay? That's called prima facie evidence. Number 4, therefore, we take points 1 and 3. 1 and 3, which is modus ponens. If 1, then 3. 1, therefore 4. So every existing thing has an explanation. The universe exists. If the universe exists and every existing thing has an explanation, then number 4 tells us the universe has an explanation. Number 2 says if it has an explanation, it's God. So point 5 is the explanation of the universe's existence is God. So you use modus ponens twice. You use a line of logic, which intercedes all through those things. There's not a single point that is refutation in science or cosmology or anything else like that. We would then take all those things and we would say, since the premises are all proven true, the conclusion follows from its premises. Therefore, this checks out as a logical syllogism, and it is a true on the truth table. So the very nature of the earth's contingent existence is proof that God exists. Now, like I said, a lot of you going, I'm not won over by this argument. Well, listen, friend, this is one of 10. And this is the most basic one. This is the simplest one. And each time we meet, both in the forum and on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings, we're going to be talking about another aspect of these proofs of God's existence. And as we engage with each of those, I'm going to challenge you to this, Christian and non-Christian alike, to do not sit in echo chambers. Christians, do not sit in Christian echo chambers where all you ever are exposed to is more Christian thought. The worst thing you could do is listen to what I'm saying and go, gospel truth? There we go. My whole worldview is solidified. I now never need to understand anything about anyone around me. False. What got you to the point of atheism in the first place is whoever's in front of you, just keep taking what they're saying as gospel truth. Don't do that to me either. So even if you're an atheist and you come in here and you go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Okay, my mind's starting to be changed. Don't take my word for it, dang it. Think for yourselves. Think, test, prod, push. Don't be indignant of people who disagree with you. As an apologist, I'm so sick of coming across atheists who laugh me off and don't give me reason, and yet in my debates, I'm 9-0. I've never lost a single debate. In a moderated form at a collegiate level, not at a Christian college even. I've never lost a debate. And yet, at the very beginning, I almost always get laughed at. Because they go, oh, well, he believes in God. And they make some kind of rhetoric, and they go, well, at least I don't believe in a God who condones slavery. And you go, oh, you think of that one all by yourself? Did you do that one all by yourself? It's like we haven't read the Bible before. Or an atheist will pitch something and they'll ask the question of like, if God is good, why is there evil? Which we'll go over in this series too. And you just go, do you really think I've never heard that? I'm a professional apologist. You think I've never come across someone who's told me M theory before? or the multiverse, subatomic particles, quarks, leptons. You don't think I've ever come across that before? I tried to disprove God, dang it. I tried to leave the faith. I tried to get away from it. You don't think I studied this? You don't think I went through every single possible marketplace idea of a paradigm that would work besides Christianity? You don't think I went there? So tonight, here's what we're going to do. We're going to engage at 6 o'clock at the forum. We're going to have a dialogue. You'll be able to ask questions in real time. You can raise your hand. We'll have a text-in thing as well. Here's one thing I would say. Don't be that guy who you're just you're brute in the way that you exercise tact, and you're disrespectful, or you have an unwillingness to dialogue. If you watched your boomer generation before you and you want to learn something from them, it's stop chucking intellectual grenades at each other and get in a room and have a conversation. So you can bring whoever you want. You can bring your atheist parents. You can bring your atheist professor. You can bring whoever has a doctorate and whatever you want to have them a doctorate on. Whoever wants to ask questions, whoever wants to prod and poke and push. I'm not concerned with who you. I just want to make sure that it's a respectful conversation. As much pushback as you want, as much criticism as you want, as much whatever. But it has to be respectful and respectable. Because that's the murder of great cogent conversation, is when we start to just produce ad hominem attacks. Word? The doors will open at 5:50 tonight. The forum's going to start at 6. It'll go for a little bit over an hour. We'll see you guys tonight.